Oh, hello, everybody. Look, I guess if you're watching this presentation, you might be aware that we had some technical difficulties when I gave this talk last night for the GSA and the Royal Society. So to try and make up for the shortfall of the lack of recording, I'm doing it as a talking head presentation. Now, the problem with my setup here at home is that my computer with the camera is here, but the screen that I look at is over here. So I'm going to kill the video so you don't have to look at my profile for the next 40 minutes or so. So when this talk was first advertised, it was mentioned that I was going to present examples of all the Australian capitals. And in the end, and given the audience that this talk was presented to yesterday, which was a Hobart audience, I ended up deciding I was being too ambitious and I would just focus on Hobart itself. So this talk is just about Hobart and the original landforms and how they've influenced that particular city. And but the things that you can learn about Hobart and the way it was influenced, its current layout was influenced by the early days, apply equally to all the other state capitals. They all had similar influences, similar things have happened. So this talk is about Hobart. As the slide says, this was done as a joint presentation for the Royal Society of Tasmania and the Geological Society of Australia, Tasmanian Division. And take note of that little building that's in the bottom right-hand corner. That's going to be talked about a little bit more in the future. That's quite a significant little building, one of many significant little buildings that survive in Hobart, but that one's just a little landmark we'll talk about later. So we'll start off in Hobart. I mean, this is a Google Earth image of central Hobart as it is now on the right. And on the left is a photograph of the Elizabeth Mall. Now, I'm going to try and convince you that geology had an influence on the way Hobart developed, quite a fundamental influence. But I'm sure that you do not think about the geology of Hobart when you're walking down the Elizabeth Mall in central Hobart, which is what this is a photograph of. But I will use the Elizabeth Mall and its location as kind of a reference point throughout this talk. It's a very historically significant street within central Hobart, and it was once the north end was once the economic and social centre of Hobart. So the records say that was a gathering point. But throughout the presentation, I'll mark most of the slides. I will mark the location of the Elizabeth Mall as this double-headed arrow. So I hope the cursor works. In fact, I'll just use this. Did that work? No, it didn't. Sorry about that. It's not going to work. I'll turn that off. All right. Hopefully the cursor is working. So this yellow arrow, double-headed arrow, will appear in various colours throughout the presentation. It will mark the location of the Elizabeth Mall. So there are really four key features in the landforms of Hobart, which was settled in 1804 by the British, who came directly from Britain when they abandoned Port Phillip Bay. Their first attempt at settlement was at Port Phillip Bay, Sorrento. They abandoned that area for largely geological reasons, and they moved down here to the Derwent to join up with a pre-existing settlement which had been established in 1803 on the eastern shore at Risdon Cove. Well, I won't be talking about Risdon Cove today, but there are four features that I've arrowed here that will be the main focus of the discussion in this presentation. So the arrow to the top right, or the right, is pointing at what became Hunter Island, now Hunter Street. The upper arrow is pointing at the Park Street or domain Rivulet, kind of Hobart's forgotten Rivulet. The left-hand arrow is pointing at a fairly central sort of position for the Hobart Rivulet, which I guess everyone who lives in Hobart is aware of. It's largely buried under urban development in this part of the city, but it's open to the air and becomes the linear park to the west. And then the sandstone cliffs that once existed on the north shore of Sullivan's Cove. So those are the four features that I'll really be discussing in this presentation. Hopefully I'll convince you that they had an influence on the way Hobart grew up in its earliest days and that they still influence us today. So the geology of Hobart is, on the face of it, quite simple. So this is the geology map of Forsyth and Clark. It's the 1 to 25,000 scale geological map of the Hobart region done by Mineral Resources Tasmania, or probably the Mines Department when this was done. It dates from 1999, so that's Mineral Resources Tasmania, I guess. So the orange areas at the top and the bottom are dolerite dikes. They're Jurassic dolerite sills and dikes that have intruded older sedimentary rocks that make up the central core of the CBD. So they're dolerite sills and or dikes, and they tend to form the high ground. So the Hobart Sullivan's Cove area is bordered by two headlands, really. In the north headland is Macquarie Point, and so the high ground is dolerite, and then Battery Point. Well, I won't be talking about those areas much today, but it is important to note that the being high ground areas around the sort of original harbour of Hobart, they became very important for defence installations and communications. So you had the Mulgrave Battery, which was installed at Battery Point. That's why the suburb of Battery Point has its name, because the first military battery was installed there. And then later on, the Albert Battery was installed higher up the hill. So the Battery Park is actually the sites of those military batteries. And then, of course, you've got the ordnance stores that are still there, the big sandstone buildings down at the bottom near the CSIRO. But then on the North Headland, you've got the site of the Queen's Battery, which was put in later, but it's now the Cenotaph. And if you look at Google Earth imagery, historic Google Earth imagery over there, you can see some of the crop marks that tend to prop up during dry weather that shows some of, I think they might be defensive positions around the battery, but it's now the Cenotaph. So, and they became focuses for other communication infrastructure like semaphores and those sorts of things. So they were very important very soon after the period I'm talking about, which is really the first 10 to 20 years. But the central part of Hobart is underlain by the green, which is coloured green, which is Triassic sandstones and mudstones. They're fairly flat lying. And they predominate throughout the central area. They're more easily eroded than the dolerite, so they tend to have formed this flat valley, which a northwest trending valley, which I call the Hobart Valley. And it's really was kind of a controlling influence on the way that the settlement spread to the north and the northwest, followed this low ground underlain by sandstone to the northwest. And then over on the western side, in brown, a small area, only a small area makes it into the city, are these Kenozoic deposits of boulder beds. They're basically rubble and other originally loose material that have, during glacial and periglacial times, have basically been shed down the sides of the hills. All the rubble and material that's falling out of the outcrops higher up is just depositing along the slopes at the base of the hill. So a lot of the western suburbs of Hobart are built on this periglacial, I think it's periglacial, but boulder bed deposits. So loose material that's kind of loosely cemented into these positions. And then the pale yellow bands are the Quaternary and recent sediments, usually associated with wetlands. And there weren't a lot of wetlands in Hobart, but associated with the course of the Hobart Rivulet, and the Park Street or Domain Rivulet, and then some of the little wetlands that came out of Montpellier Retreat down near where Parliament House is. So that's kind of the geology of Hobart. Deceptively simple, but I think we don't know a lot about what goes on at depth below Hobart, because there's a lot of drilling, but it's all site foundation drilling, and it doesn't really go very deep. I think I started to put together a drill hole database for the centre of the city, and only the information that's publicly available only shows holes go down about maybe 10, 12, maybe 15 metres in some cases. Very little information about what goes on at depth below Hobart. So anyway, that's the basic geology. Everything else that you see here is reclaimed land. But then the work I've been doing is to try and reconstruct the landscapes as they existed in 1804, in this case, in the case of Hobart. So this shows the coastline as it was in 1804, and just overlain on the geology and all the watercourses that existed there. So we've got the Hobart Rivulet. It had some small runnels that joined it at various points along its course. There's the Domain Rivulet, which had its own independent mouth into Sullivan's Cove. And then there was the small rivulets and intermittent streams that drained Montpelier Retreat and St David's Park. St David's Park, the old cemetery, is quite a large catchment. And there was a little wetland and sort of some sort of marshy area at the mouth of that, which is now kind of where, it's where the park is in front of Parliament House, but into Salamanca Place. And then one of the really important features that I'll be talking about quite a bit is this little dolerite islet that occurs up in the near the mouth of the rivulets. And it was joined to the mainland by a sandy spit that was covered by water at high tide. And it was just this little oval-shaped dolerite outcrop that just stuck out of the bay, and it was associated with a series of dolerite reefs. So it's all very shallow dolerite rocky reefs and shore platforms. But this little island was quite a prominent feature in the early days of the settlement. And once again, here's that arrow that represents where Elizabeth Street Mall is, the red double-headed arrow. So this is the reconstruction that I've come up with. The contours are 2 metre intervals, and basically the key features were this central ridge, which was formed on the lower, more easily eroded sandstones. That's sort of this rising ground that went to the southwest of the central part of the city. If you go over to the Domain and stand up where the cenotaph is and look down into the city along all the main east-west streets of the city, you see very clearly this rising ground as it heads up to the southwest from basically the City Hall area, the low-lying areas around the eastern end of the town. It's a very distinctive feature. So I've just named it the Central Ridge. It's not a formal name. And there's this name that I've also, informal name I've used for Hobart Settlement Valley, which is just this low area formed on the sandstones. But once again, the high ground formed by the dolerites on either headland of Sullivan's Cove itself, and then the little dolerite islet, of course. And then the sandstone cliffs that formed the high ground on the western shore of the cove. So the vegetation, which I'll talk about in a minute, it was mostly fairly barren, open woodland, but big trees, but it got particularly brushy, remnant rainforest all along the course of the rivulet and probably in the lower reaches of the Domain Rivulet as well. So when the British arrived in 1804, when they decided to abandon first Port Phillip and then came down here to the Derwent and decided that Risdon Cove wasn't a particularly good spot. A lot of the reasons Risdon isn't a particularly good spot for a settlement are geological as well, particularly the really poor rivulet that drains Risdon Cove. It just wasn't very good for a large settlement. So they moved over to the Western Shore, but a lot of the information that they based that decision on must have already been collected by James Meehan, who was he was an assistant surveyor. He's a convict. He was an Irish convict who was sent to the colonies, sent out here with to New South Wales, and then he was sent down here as a surveyor for the Risdon settlement. They came from Sydney, but he had already done a lot of traverses along the Western Shore. He'd been sent over here by Bowen to actually take a look at the land on the Western Shore. So he'd already collected a lot of information. But anyway, that's by the by. I'll talk about him a little bit more in a minute. But so the camp was actually laid out here. This is the layout of the camp, which is based on a plan I'll show you in a few minutes, which is by George Harris. But to zoom in on the area that really counts in the first days of the settlement, we'll just zoom in on that camp area. So we basically have the Dollarite Island, the sand spit, the mouth of the rivulet, and what everyone describes as how they, to access the land here, they rode up the rivulet to the mouth of the rivulet. They did a sharp left-hand bend, and then there was a sandy landing place that you could actually beach the boats and get out. So the first landing place was really where that partially hidden green square is, at the crook of the arm of the rivulet mouth. But the camp was laid out on the rising ground of what I've called the Central Ridge. So the really important features about the layout of the camp, and we'll talk about this a lot later, is the government house was a prefabricated building they brought from England, and they built this little wooden prefabricated shack for the governor as a temporary government house. And then all the other officials of the settlement set themselves up along the cliff top, along these sandstone cliffs, adjacent to Government House, and people like Robert Knockwood, the chaplain, and the assistant commissary, and all the other officials set themselves up along the cliff tops on the shore of the cove. It might have been simply just because they wanted a view, or it might have been a position of authority, but it was certainly the place they all chose to camp. I think the mineralogists camped way down here. But then they put the convicts in their little huts and temporary humpies and things all along the rivulet. So all the little triangles along the western side here that follow the rivulet are all the sort of huts and tents of the convicts. And then they put the Royal Marines in a sort of a slightly barricaded area. They kind of put them up above all the convicts, and probably as a kind of a defensive position if the convicts rioted, but also so they could defend the administrators along the cliff top. And then there was eventually a bridge built, which just consisted of some logs that were moved into position over the really steep banks of the rivulet. The rivulet actually was very difficult to cross. It's deeply incised for most of its length. So they had to roll logs across it here, where eventually Elizabeth Street would evolve, so that they could access the best timber of the area, which was all to the northwest of the settlement. So that the low slopes of Hobart itself, the timber wasn't very good. It was kind of open woodland, and there was lots of brush along the rivulet, but the best timber was to the northwest of the settlement. So they set up blacksmith shops, and they set up timber saw pits and sawmills, saw pits, there were no sawmills over here to access the run of timber that went up to the northwest. And then the surgeon pitched his tent and set up a little hospital for the convicts just to the north of the rivulet. So once the bridge went in, most of the access to the hospital and all this small industry area was all via this log bridge. So it became the only access to the north area of the settlement, but everything focused around this central ridge. And then in the early days of the camp, they were offloading the stores just onto the beach at the head, somewhere around the head of the sand spit. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But eventually, Hunter Island, as it became known, the little Dollarite Islet, became the main and first commissariat store, the first store for food and supplies, and for the camp, because everything was supplied by the government. All the convicts and the staff were fed from the commissariat store. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. But obviously, the most important landscape feature of the Hobart settlement in 1804 was the rivulet. It's the main reason why the Sullivan's Cove was chosen above all the other coves along the western shore, because it had a regular supply of water. So I haven't put in a map that shows the modern rivulet. I really wanted to use this plan of James Meehan's, which was done in 1803 and 4. It's been annotated, but the Hobart rivulet is arrowed in blue, and this is a survey he did before the Collins expedition, the 1804 expedition from Britain, actually arrived. He landed on way down near Taroona somewhere and followed the coastline up to the north past Rest Point, and he was going to camp at Sandy Bay, but there wasn't any water there, and so because there was no water, they decided to go another mile or two up the coast, and they came across a neat little stream, and they camped there for the night. And he blazed a tree there, and then he walked up the Rivulet and described. All he said about the country at the Rivulet there at the time was, the note I put down the bottom, which I quite like, is the land on each side of the stream is highly barren. So that's all he said about it. But later descriptions, which I'll talk about in a minute, really do show that there was quite a diverse vegetation styles around the Rivulet on the high ground, and it varied according to altitude and geology. But I don't talk much about that, but it's certainly more diverse, and I'll show you some of the reasons I say that in a minute. Up here to the north, next to the red lettering, has been added in later. These strange shaped blocks are the free settler blocks around the Newtown Rivulet and Newtown Bay, which at the time was known as Stainforth's Cove. And then Risdon itself is over on the eastern shore. It's up here. Hopefully my cursor is working, but it's really basically on the opposite shore, just to the northeast of the settler blocks, which are those strange rectangular shapes around the Newtown Rivulet, just to the left of where I've written Meehan's datum tree. Sorry, I won't know if this cursor works until I see the recording of this. So the Rivulet was a regular supply of water because it was constantly fed by springs on the slopes of Mount Wellington. So we obviously have the springs up near Ferntree, which is one of the sources, and those springs are constantly fed from groundwater that's stored in the boulder bed site, the deposits of rubble and debris that have shed down the mountains forever. And the Rivulet is actually fed by water coming out of those deposits and as springs, and eventually feeding the head of the Rivulet. It's fed by other runnels and things that feed drainage into it along its length, but it's a regular supply of water, mainly because it's fed by this reservoir of groundwater that's stored in the boulder beds and other scree deposits up on the slopes of the mountain. So basically the Rivulet is a reliable source of water because of the geology of the superficial deposits on the flanks of the mountain. So that's kind of important too. And some of the geological features that the Rivulet crosses, which I don't talk about much, are things like the Cascades, which were a series of kind of stepped waterfalls where the Rivulet cuts across the Cascades, which we know it to be the Cascades Fault now, which is one of the bounding faults of the lower Derwent Graben. But they were quite significant waterfalls with a big pond at the bottom of the largest of them, and that basically became the site of the Cascades Brewery. So the Cascades are a geological feature, a structural feature, and the brewery is named after them. I don't talk about that sort of stuff much, but anyway, that's the Rivulet. That's the first major feature that we are interested in. Now, in 1804, the assistant government surveyor was George Prideaux Harris. Now, he produced this map of the Rivulet. He traversed up from the camp, which is in the top right-hand corner, so where the CBD is now. He traversed all the way up the Rivulet, pretty much as far as it goes up the mountain. Now, Harris is, he wasn't a very good surveyor, I'm afraid, but I think he was a tremendous artist. And so this plan that he created of the Rivulet is not particularly accurate when it comes to the bends and the course of the Rivulet, as we know it is today, thanks to more accurate mapping. But what it is, if you zoom in on it, is it's a tremendous record of what the vegetation was in the actual incised course of the Rivulet. So he did this terrific job of just annotating it as he went. And he talks about things like thick brush. Now, brush was kind of a term they used in the 19th century for rainforest, very thick, dense, usually wet and tangled rainforest. So he's describing the vegetation, and because he's an artist, I think he's a great artist. He's a really good one anyway. And I'll show you another example of his work in a minute. But he he recorded the vegetation around the margins of the rivulet. And now one of the descriptions of the rivulet is that from the camp itself, the land dropped very steeply, about 150 feet into the course of the rivulet. So it was very deeply incised. So down within this deeply incised valley of the rivulet, it was a micro environment which apparently preserved rainforest, whereas the hills surrounding it were all covered in blue gum and sassafras and sort of drier land species, sclerophyll forest. But yeah, down in the rivulet, it was quite wet and quite a micro environment. So even though poor old Harris didn't do a particularly good job surveying the rivulet, he did provide us with this remarkable information. And he also provided us with the only map that we have of the layout of the camp as it was in 1804. So once again, it shows the marine. This is where I've based mine on, plus I also referred to another reconstruction of this area that was done by a really great historian called Frank Bolt, the late Frank Bolt, no longer with us. He compiled a lot of this information and reconstructed a map of the Hobart camp, very similar to mine. But anyway, the main record we have of the 1804 camp is this plan of Harris's. That's why I've zoomed in on this particular area. And he talks about the government gardens down here, which you hardly hear mentioned. I don't know why they would have put them up on that high ground, but anyway, that's what they did. So I have tried to wring as much information out of that plan as I can. So I cut it up and montaged it and tried to reference all the bends that Harris included in his survey back to my three-dimensional reconstruction of the topography and later maps that recorded the original course of the rivulet more accurately. There's lots of other maps that have come since Harris, but his is the only one that records the vegetation. So this is my kind of attempt to montage his work and then register it in 3D with my topographic reconstruction to end up with something like this. So this is a screenshot of the 3D model of the topography of Hobart circa 1804, just showing all these features I've already talked about and some other features I haven't talked about. Once again, the red line is representing where the Elizabeth Mall is still. And but showing the layout of the camp and sort of the vegetation that Harris described, plus a little bit of my interpretation. I think that it was probably rainforest going up the main rivulet, that tongue of green that goes up to the top right-hand corner. But as I said, with a bit more work, which I haven't done yet, I would like to actually try and see if I can reconstruct the vegetation all along the course of the rivulet based on Harris's map, because he actually does he records things like, he doesn't just record the type of vegetation down in there, like the sassafras and the fern glades and the blue gum. He talks about really large blue gums in the area on one shore, but he also talks about islets and stone rapids and various other outcrop features within the course of the rivulet. So it's a kind of a real font of information, which I'll hopefully get back to one day and put together and try and prove that he, like I said, not the greatest of surveyors, but I think he gave us some really key information about the rivulet as it was in 1804, probably the only information we really have. So anyway, that's the way I've kind of used Harris's plan of the rivulet. So that's the Hobart rivulet, the kind of the main reason that Hobart is where it is. But then we need to talk about the little dolerite islet, Hunter Island. It became known after the governor of New South Wales. So this little dolerite island, which is, you can't see it anymore, but you can actually walk around its boundaries, because if you go down to Hunter Street, where the IXL jam factory is, its course is actually, the boundaries of it have actually been marked with brass markers in the pavement there, plus there's brass markers that follow this bit of land up to the Grand Chancellor. The little island is really important because it provided a secure source, a site to put all the stores. If you've got several hundred fairly hungry convicts and Marines for that matter, and everybody else, it's a good idea to keep your food stores in a secure spot. So they chose the island eventually, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But they chose the island because it was cut off from the mainland when the spit was covered at high tide. So they could put the stores out there. So they built a temporary storehouse and some guard tents and things, and they offload, and they eventually built a jetty. And the ship, the Ocean, the main store ship they had with them that had come from Britain, was anchored just here, just offshore of the island, and they eventually brought the stores over to Hunter Island. So it became the first commissariat store, first food store for the settlement. But let's talk a little bit more about it. The Sandspit was the site where all the stores were being offloaded in the early days of in the very first days when they were unloading the Ocean. And Collins had to actually send a note to Captain Murtho to say, can you please stop unloading your stores? We've got a backlog, we just can't shift them. They had nowhere to put them. So that's when they decided to set up the island as this commissariat store. So basically they were forced into creating the island as a storage area because the stores were being unloaded by the ship too quickly and they had no secure place to put them. So they were being unloaded onto the shore just near here, and that site actually became, it's not far from the place where the commissariat store, the current historic building, the solid brick building that we have it still extant in Hobart, was built. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So a little bit more about Hunter Island. This beautiful picture is the one that, if you've read anything about the foundation of Hobart, will almost definitely be in a book or anything you've read in some form or other. Very pretty little watercolour that shows the island itself on the left with the ocean moored offshore and one of the other tender vessels just nearby, with a spit of land going up to the cliffs, the sandstone cliffs. So we've got a dolerite island in the foreground. The artist who painted this, it's been attributed to George Evans after a sketch by George Harris. But the person that painted this must have been standing on Macquarie Point on the shore platform, and judging by the geological information about Macquarie Point and the appearance of the sketches here, it's definitely dolerite. And the island was dolerite too, so these rounded boulders of dolerite. But it was joined to us by sand spit from the mouth of the Rivulet, which curved around to the right. But the cliffs forming the shore of Sullivan's Cove was sandstone. They're Triassic sandstones, and the camp was basically set up on the top of those cliffs, looking out over the bay. And the way that looks today, this isn't a super accurate imposition of a modern day image, but that's kind of where I think, as well as I can, I want to go back and try and get better angles. But this is what the same scene looks today, because the wharf area has been opened up to us over the recent years because it's all being redeveloped. It's not a closed off wharf area. We can actually walk through these areas now. We can actually recapture that view. So approximately, even though it's all reclaimed. And we've got some reference points. We know that Hunter Island is under Hunter Street because all the wharf area has been reclaimed around it. The old wharf was built up around it, and then the factories and everything were built on top of it. But we've got, just poking through over here to the right, you can see the dome of the old Customs House, which is the headquarters for Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. Well, that was actually built just on the shore, a reclaimed land on the shore at the mouth of the Rivulet as the bond store. It was built in the 1820s. It's not the commissariat store, but if you know anything about TMAG, you'll know that the commissariat store is over to the right towards the concert hall for the Grand Chancellor. But anyway, that's what my feeling is about where what that famous view of Hunter Island is. But I have to confess that I much prefer this sketch. And the reason I prefer this sketch is because it's almost definitely done by George Harris and proves to me that he was a good artist. But I love this more because even though it's a sketch, it must have been done by a person actually standing there. And so this is actually a snapshot. I mean, so the previous picture has been reworked probably from this sketch, and the proportions are all different. So often these images are reworked by somebody who wants to make them look better or more appealing to a European audience or something. And they've added in little details that weren't in the original sketch. But when you go to the real sketch, you're actually getting the view of the person that stood there. Now, I think this had to have been done by George Harris, who was actually standing on the shore platforms at Macquarie Point looking back at the settlement. So he's got the ocean and the little tender vessel, and I forgot the name yesterday, and I've forgotten it again today. Sorry about that. But the interesting thing, there's a lot of interesting things about this little sketch. And the proportions are so different. The island looks bigger compared to the ship, and the sand spit, everything is I think, a more realistic proportion. The figures that are moving along the spit, there doesn't seem to be any hint of a cart or a cannon, and various other people have called all sorts of strange things that these guys are carting in the previous image. But in this one, there just seem to be 5 little figures walking. They're not pulling anything. But over here, there's a little dot in the middle that looks like a little boat with a couple of people in it. Now, once again, I hope my cursor's working. Otherwise, I hope you can see what I'm pointing at. But there's little dark figures just in the middle of the bay, to the top left of the 5 figures walking across the spit, and to the left of the cliffs. That looks like a little boat, and it doesn't show up in this other one. There's no sign of it there. But I wonder sometimes whether that isn't some Aboriginal people on one of their little bark canoes in here, because one thing I haven't had a chance, I don't really have time to talk about in this this presentation, is the concept that when Captain Murtho was unloading the ship, Robert Knockwood, the chaplain, made a note that he saw Murtho down on the shoreline chatting to some Aboriginal people, and that they were all around the camp at various times, but no one could entice them to come in, and probably, for good measure. I wouldn't trust a whole bunch of people just lobbed into my land either. But they were there, and they were quite friendly relations. But yeah, so Murtho, as he was unloading the ship, was just chatting to some Aboriginal people who just happened to be heading past, I guess. But I do wonder, I do like the idea that maybe that little tiny figure out there in Sullivan's Cove might have actually been some Aboriginal people, because views like this are quite common in Sydney, where the Aboriginal people were always going past Sydney and fishing in Sydney Cove. So anyway, so I do just wonder whether that couldn't be Aboriginal people, but it's just a nice little detail. And I'm sorry I don't talk much about the Aboriginal involvement in this area. It's just a bit outside the topic I'm trying to talk about. And this is my attempt to fit that into the modern, far more prosaic world that we live in. But at least we can go there and look at it from that perspective now. And what's interesting is that I had to use a different photo to try and fit the sketch into modern Hobart compared to the painting. And it just shows how much the painting's been reworked, I think, and the proportions have changed. So please forgive me, because the backgrounds don't match. Obviously, Mount Wellington is not in the background there. But I think I'm either in the wrong spot. I probably am in the wrong spot. I'll go back and try and find a better view in the future. But or all the sketches have been reworked, or they just wanted to make sure the mountain was in the background. But I suspect it's simply because I'm in a different angle. But anyway, please forgive me for that. So Hunter Island became the first commissariat store once the stores started to pile up on the beach, on the spit. But then eventually, very quickly, they needed to start making bricks, which I didn't mention in the talk yesterday. But yeah, they had to start making bricks from local materials very quickly, and then they eventually came to construct the commissariat store, the more permanent structure, which was built right on the shoreline. So that structure is still with us. That building is still with us, and it's a core feature of the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. That is one of the pivot point buildings of historic Hobart. That building has basically appeared in pretty much every every plan of Hobart done since it was built in, it was completed in 1810. So within 6 years of arrival. So the arrow is actually pointing at 2 buildings, but that's just showing the position of it is where it was in kind of the original landscape. But so this is one of the pivot point buildings of Hobart that is a reference point for basically all the changes that have occurred around it, and I'll talk about another one soon. It was followed within 10 or so years by a second building, which was actually built on reclaimed lands, and that's the Bond Store, which is the brick building that I'm showing in the lower right. Now that building was built when the town was quite an established settlement, and it was more to do with importing materials and charging duty on them. But that's the building that became the new Customs House after the original Customs House, which is current Parliament House, was taken over by the politicians. But they converted the Bond Store, which is in the lower right. That's the back of it. That's what it really looks like. What they did is they slapped a Victorian sandstone facade on the front with statues of Britannia and all that sort of stuff, which made it look quite grand. But really, just in behind it is the old Bond Store, which is still a lovely building, but it's just a little bit more working class or workaday. But anyway, I prefer the photo from the back. That's what it was. That's what it kind of looked like. So these 2 buildings sort of set the pattern of that eastern end of Hobart into place, because they were near the Hunter Island. Hunter Island eventually grew into, by land reclamation, it became, and the original jetty, it became what became known as the Old Wharfs, but they became the original wharf area for Hobart. So because they built a jetty off the end of Hunter Island, and they eventually started to reclaim the land around it to make it a more permanent wharf area, it became the Old Wharf of Hobart. So it set the tone of that eastern end, the Commissariat Store, the Bond Store, the wharves, Hunter Island becoming the wharves, all set the tone that the east end of Hobart, at the mouth of the Rivulet, would become the kind of industrial end of Hobart, the commercial end of Hobart. And it sort of set that function in place from almost the very beginning. And so the next feature I'd like to talk about is I was kind of interested when I discovered it existed. It's not something you hear a lot about. The Park Street or Domain Rivulet. It's quite a significant stream that wasn't, it was quite a significant watercourse, certainly when it got to its southern end. And it follows the course of the Brooker Highway, the modern Brooker, basically. And it's formed along a fault line, which I didn't mention when I was talking about the geology. If you can think back to the geology image, there was a blue line marked on it, which I think is a fault line. But anyway, the Domain Rivulet, with the red arrow pointing at it, was a second stream. It wasn't a flowing stream like the Hobart Rivulet, except at its southern end. It was really just a drainage line that captured all the drainage coming off the western side of the domain and the inner city suburbs of Hobart, coming down off Limekiln Hill and that sort of drainage. So it was really only a runoff channel, as opposed to the Rivulet, the Hobart Rivulet, which was, being supplied by the springs up on Mount Wellington, so more permanent flowing. But it was still significant, and it would occasionally flood. But it had its own mouth into Sullivan's Cove, separate to the Hobart Rivulet. So yeah, so it's kind of the one we never hear about, but it is now pretty much the alignment of the Brooker Highway. It's all been covered over. It's still a drainage line underneath the highway, but it's if you go up to the university, the old university, the Domain House, and look down towards the ABC, which is the old railway station, and across to the Royal Hobart Hospital, you really see how deeply incised that valley was. And there's some beautiful paintings of that area that that from the early days that really show just how deeply in size it was. And it formed the eastern boundary of the metropolitan area. It still pretty much does, apart from suburbs like Glebe, which have been built on the opposite side on land that was actually granted to the church. I mean, that's what a glebe is. A glebe is land that's granted to a parish to support the for the upkeep of the priest, for the vicar, if you're Anglican. And so the glebe land must have been donated to the church at some stage for the upkeep of for income generating for the local church officials, and became a suburb. But mostly the domain rivulet forms the eastern boundary of Hobart, and it has from the very beginning. It was quite a gully in places. So it was kind of a defining feature of the eastern edge of Hobart in a way. The Brooker still is. So the point that's of kind of interest to the future discussion in this talk is that the ground between the domain rivulet, the mouth of the domain rivulet, and the Hobart rivulet was very low lying and quite marshy. And it was basically not very good for housing because it was just a little bit flood prone. So we all know about the flooding in Hobart, and I'll talk about that later. But certainly the central city, it can still flood around Collins Street, and the City Hall area and central city. So that land has always been flood prone, and it's because both drainage lines enter the area, and the flat lying land between it just gets overwhelmed sometimes by the drainage. And that's very important to the future evolution of Hobart, because it became that flood-prone ground at the head of the wharves, of the old wharves, became the area that eventually became known as Whopping. Whopping was an industrial area where kind of a lot of the noxious industries got focused in early Hobart, because a lot of noxious industries like abattoirs, tanneries, and candle makers need good drainage. You don't want abattoirs upstream of your water supply because of all the offal they pour into the waterways. So they tend to accumulate near the mouths of the river or downstream from any settlement, and they're smelly, and people don't like living with them. Even in the 19th century, people didn't like living next to abattoirs and tanneries. So they tended to accumulate on the fringes of towns where there was drainage that wasn't going to flow past people's back doors. So in Hobart, that tended to be the mouths of the rivulet at the head of Sullivan's Cove. And it was also convenient because that's where the wharves were developing around the reclaimed land around Hunter Island. So in the end, the wharves and the abattoirs and the other industries that that were kind of noxious tended to accumulate on this flood-prone land because it wasn't particularly good for housing anyway. So yeah, so this was the beginning of Whopping, which became eventually it became quite a lot of poor people came to live there because there was a lot of work available in these noxious industries. And plus later on, it became a focus of transport, but there was also work on the wharves. So all the things associated with the wharves and the noxious industries became focused there. And it got the name Whopping because the east end of London, the Whopping area there was a very similar area. It had, on a grander scale, it was a wharf area with a lot of noxious industries and quite flood prone. So yeah, I don't think it was ever, in Hobart, it was never officially named Whopping. It just became known as Whopping because of that association with a similar district in London, which I might add in London is now an elite suburb. The East End has all been redeveloped like our Whopping is. But anyway, it became a focus of poor housing because of the work that was available. It got a bit of a reputation as a red light district. And then eventually it sort of morphed in the early 20th century. A lot of the slums were cleared. The old cottages and poor housing were cleared, and it ended up kind of becoming a focus of transport infrastructure like engineering works and motor garages and those sorts of features. That's why there's so many red brick sort of buildings in that part of town still. They're all dating from the early to mid 20th century when it was a focus of transport infrastructure, because the rail yards, which is next to Whopping, It became a tramway depot, and then it became a bus depot, and the bus depot's only just recently been redeveloped into townhouses, some of which are kind of a bit ugly, in my opinion, anyway. But it still retains a lot of the 1920s and 30s buildings associated with the transport industry, and like I said, the rail yards were just nearby, and a lot of the wharves, all the wharf industry was just nearby as well. So very industrial part of Hobart, with quite poor housing, which was only really cleared out in the early 20th century. And just an arrow to show you, just to show the commissariat store and the bond store that eventually developed, that sort of set the pattern in place, along with Hunter Island, for why this became the industrial end of town. And yeah, that little fly in is just to remind me to say that this has all happened, this whole area of Hobart developed in the way it did, really simply because there was a little dolerite island at the mouth of the Rivulet there. And it just set these usages in place for the rest of pretty much the history of Hobart, right down until pretty much today, even though all those areas are being gentrified, the old factory sites being gentrified, they're still with us, really, all because of that little island, which is still buried below Hunter Street. So in 1811, not long after poor David Collins died suddenly, probably as a result of his interactions with Governor Bligh, who came down to Hobart from Sydney after he got kicked out by the Rum Corps, came down to Hobart to try and get David Collins to support him, and was not a very nice person, really, Bligh. Anyway, I'm not saying that Collins died because of Bligh, but it can't have been easy on him. Anyway, he died in 1810, and the new governor up in New South Wales, Governor Macquarie, came down to Hobart to have a look at the settlement and decided that it was a bit of a shambles, that it really hadn't developed that much from the original camp of sort of 7 years before. So he sent James Meehan back, who was now an assistant surveyor and being freed, to establish a street grid, to make to basically survey out regular streets for central Hobart. So just as a reminder, this is the plan that one of the plans that Meehan produced from one of the various reports of the original street grid of central Hobart. And I thought I'll just remind you that the double-headed blue arrow is the Elizabeth Mall, just to remind you that I've got those arrows, try to keep you in touch with where that is. Yeah, so Meehan came down to impose a modern street grid at the command of the governor. And he used as a datum the same tree that he used when he camped there in 1803 or early 1804. The same tree was still there. So the triangle, the red triangle at the top right, is the tree that he used as the datum for his survey of Hobart cities in streets in 1811. And thanks to the work of Frank Bolt, who took Meehan's survey books and replotted all his surveys, we know quite a lot of detail about Meehan's survey, apart from actually getting these contemporary plans. Frank Bolt did an amazing job of putting a lot of this information together as well. And there is actually a plaque just next to City Hall where this tree once stood. So you can actually go and stand on the place that Meehan used as the datum to lay out central Hobart. I didn't put a photograph of that in, but it's worth going. It's still a fairly workaday area of Hobart, but it's go and have a look at that plaque, and you can actually sort of stand on the point where Meehan stood in 1804 and 1811. I'm not sure if Meehan was actually on the Western Shore in 1803 or 1804. That's why I prevaricate about that. But as Meehan did his survey, you can see from that plan that he didn't create a perfect 90-degree grid like a Roman fort or a Roman city. And I think other historians have speculated about this. People like Frank Bolt, who know a lot more about it than I do. They think that he didn't impose a regular street grid because he tried to take into consideration all the existing homes and land tenure that were kind of fairly higgledy-piggledy distributed across the central ridge of the original area of the camp. So I think it seems that he tried to accommodate existing buildings and fence lines and property ownership that already existed. So he didn't just come in and, like a bureaucrat, and just impose a grid and if your house was in the middle of the street, it got demolished. It seems like he tried to accommodate as much of the existing layout of the settlement as possible. And what that means is that if the original settlement was still controlled organically by the original landforms, so huts were just wherever people chose to put them according to landform, then really the layout of the camp had an impact on the layout of the modern city, because the roads weren't just imposed without consideration of what had come before. So the old landscape had a bit of an influence on the layout of the streets. And that's why the streets in central Hobart are just not regular. So I think I think highly of him for that. He might have had the power to come in and just impose the grid on everything, but I don't know if he had that power or not, but he might have, and he didn't. So I think that if you took into consideration the people that were already there, then I think that makes him a nice guy, really. So anyway, so that's the 1811 survey. So going back to my reconstruction, I've added in Meehan's survey to the 1804 reconstruction of the landscape. It's not quite accurate. There was reclamation going on by this stage, but anyway, I've just left it with the 1804 reconstruction. So I've shown Meehan's datum tree here. I've arrowed it. But what was really important about what Meehan did was that he took the survey and he formalised all the locations of these of the dark black boxes that are all along the cliff top area. They were all still government land, but he took the survey and formalised the boundaries of all these small blocks where colonial officials were still living, particularly Government House, which was still only a small building at this stage at 1811. Still, I think it only just been a couple of things built on to the original prefabricated building. But what he did is he formalised the tenure on those blocks of land. And that's very important to something I'll talk about later on, the later layout of Hobart. And we have the Flagstaff, which was always an important feature of these British settlements. Government House, which, like I said, was still a fairly small building at this stage, just a hut, which apparently had leaky walls and everything when Collins was living in it. But he did establish George's Square, which is still with us now. Half of it is still Franklin Square, and the other half is occupied by the Treasury complex. And basically formalised all those government land tenures along the cliff tops, which had just been where in 1804 they pitched their tents. So that becomes quite important in something I'll talk about in a minute, I think. So zooming in on that, I did this yesterday, sorry. I should have zoomed in now and when I was just discussing what I've just said. But basically, the point is that the cliff tops, which was the point where they put all their tents, ended up getting formalised during Meehan's survey into more formalised land tenure blocks, and they became part of the streetscape of the city. And then, of course, by 1811, the hospital's still on the other side of the Rivulet. Basically, the hospital. I'm not sure that the original 1804 plan shows exactly where it is correctly, or was. But by 1811, with Meehan's survey, it was definitely located there. In the earlier 1804 reconstruction, I had it over to the right near the red arrow somewhere. But basically what it means is that the hospital is still north of the Rivulet, and that's also important to kind of what I'll talk about in a minute. So following Meehan's survey, the town continued to evolve. And some new features got added in over the years. So the bond store, which I'm showing in red there, got added in. there was a canal put in, and this is really important. A canal was constructed in the 1820s to link the Hobart Rivulet to the Domain Rivulet. And this is the canal that's still with us. This is the Collins Street Canal. And so it diverted the flow of the Hobart Rivulet straight to the mouth to join it up with the Domain Rivulet estuary. And so from basically the 1820s onwards, excuse me, the Hobart Rivulet drained right up until World War I. It drained out what was originally just the mouth of the Domain Rivulet, and it freed up all this land at the head of the sand spit, at the head of the old wharves, which freed them up for this market space. But I'll just stick to this diagram for another minute. So that was the mouth of both rivulets until World War I, basically. But then they put through the Domain Rivulet, which must have been some really hard drilling, excavation, because it's all diorite. But they put in a tunnel, which was completed in 1916, out to Macquarie Point. And you can go and look at the portal of this. This is the current outlet of the Hobart Rivulet now. But that was done in 1916. But until then, the mouth of the Domain Rivulet was actually the outlet for both watercourses. But anyway, I'll zoom in now. So by diverting the Hobart Rivulet with the canal, like I said, you can still go and look at that canal, it's still there. It freed up all this land, which was reclaimed, which was backfilled, and it created the space for a marketplace. So it was all built out as a marketplace. And the other important features that came in the 1820s and afterwards, or still that were already there, was the bond store, which I've already mentioned, but more particularly the Governor's Secretary's residence, which was a little building I'll talk about on a couple of slides to come. Basically, in the early days, the Governor was looking for some accommodation for his personal secretary, and there was an old workshop there, which had been from the earliest days. And basically, he was recommended to the Governor that little building get reconstructed using timber from a demolished building nearby and rebuilt into a cottage. So it became the residence for his secretary, which used to be in the grounds of Government House, which were all gardens originally. Government House was much bigger by the 1820s. It had been consolidated, and a larger brick building had been constructed rather than just a little prefab that had been there in 1811 when Meehan did his survey, and a series of other ancillary buildings, but still along that government series of government blocks of land along the top of what had been the cliffs. There'd been a lot more reclamation by this stage. But anyway, so the Governor's Secretary's cottage was constructed as for his personal secretary, and the bond store, but particularly the market square. So this really emphasising the commercial area of the eastern end of town, which became the economic centre, the industrial and economic centre of Hobart pretty much for the 19th century, really, and the hospital. So I debated when I was putting this presentation together whether I'd talk about the Sullivan's Cove sandstone cliffs before I talked about Meehan's survey, or whether I'd talk about them afterwards. In the end, I decided it was better to do it now. So I'm kind of jumping back a little bit now to, I just want to talk about the Sullivan's Cove cliffs, which were formed in the Triassic sandstones. So I've gone back to a Google Earth image, but this is that pretty little watercolor. I'm using it because it just shows the cliffs a lot better than Brett O'Harris's snapshot sketch. But basically, this is kind of what the cliffs look like that formed the western shore of Sullivan's Cove, all underlain by Triassic. Now, the reason they're so important is because those government blocks that were, those government tents that were pitched at the top of the cliffs ended up, and then getting formalised by Meehan's the land tenure getting formalised by Meehan's 1811 survey, ended up setting in place the pretty much the location of the government quarter in modern Hobart. So in 1804, the simple decision about where are we going to put the tents for the Governor and all his entourage, I'll stick them over there at the head of the cliffs. That's as good a spot as any. It might have been because there was a view. It might have been for security reasons to keep them away from the convicts. But in the end, when Meehan came in and formalised the streetscape and formalised the land tenures around the centre of the city, it formalised the government usage of those blocks, even though Government House was obviously there. So it was just a matter of they became surveyed into the streetscape of modern Hobart. So that very simple choice of, and I'll emphasise this a bit more in a minute, but that simple choice of let's put the tents over there for the governor and everybody else, and let's put the convicts over there, which must have happened on the day they came ashore. Whenever the governor, David Collins, was living in his marquee within a couple of days of arriving. So this very quick decision has set in this pattern, which I'll try and emphasise a bit more in a sec. So there's the Sandstone Cliffs. This is the current land tenure map for Central Hobart. Sorry, I've already flashed it up a bit, but this is where I really want to talk about it. Now, if I zoom in on that area in the box, just back to the 1803, 1804 reconstruction, this is the current land tenure map for that area of Hobart. So what's really interesting about this is that, so Government House, which is long gone, it's no longer there, but the government tents were pitched along the cliff tops. The hospital was set up on the far side of the Rivulet, and basically that pattern of those simple decisions made in the first couple of days of the camp in Sullivan's Cove in 1804 basically have set in place the locations of all the government quarter of Central Hobart. It's the location of the Hobart Town Hall, was where the Flagstaff was. Government House is gone. It's now been completely bulldozed, and the Elizabeth Street's been driven right through it. But Franklin Square still marks part of the government, part of the Governor's Gardens, Government House Gardens. The Tasmanian Museum occupies part of the of those blocks, and the Treasury and building occupies the western end of George's Square. But what's really interesting is that the simple decision about let's put the surgeon's tent on the opposite side of the Rivulet, for whatever reason they decided to do that for, set in place the location of the Royal Hobart Hospital. It is still there on the same block, and the canal runs past its southeastern end, and that's where the Rivulet used to be. But for whatever reason, the surgeon decided to put his tent over that far side. It is still the centre of health services in Hobart and in Tasmania, really. It's still the major hospital in Tasmania. So these simple decisions made in 1804 are basically still controlling the land use of Central Hobart. The government quarter and the health quarter are pretty much in the same place they've been since the Brits arrived. And I find that kind of interesting, and it's all because of those sandstone cliffs, really, and the location of the Rivulet. But the government quarter is particularly there because of the sandstone cliffs, where it could have been as simple as that they wanted a view, or they wanted the fresh air from the sea, or something. I think there was more to it than that, but it could have been that simple. Let's put the tents over there. There's a good view, and it will get a nice breeze, probably because the convicts are going to be smelling. Who knows? It could have been as simple as that. But that simple decision is still the layer of, Hobart in 2022. So I found that rather interesting when I realised that. It wasn't that early, wasn't that long ago I realised that. And but anyway, that's what I mean by simple. Little things meant a lot. So something that simple in the first week of the colony are still setting patterns in modern Hobart. But anyway, I've got a couple of slides here about the Governor's Secretary's cottage, and the reason I wanted to talk about it is because it's just one of these amazing little pivot point buildings in Central Hobart. It's been the witness, this little building, to all of the nearly all of the landscape changes that have happened across Central Hobart since since certainly the 1820s and probably before. And this photo is were sent to me by Tony Hope, who wrote his book about the Quarry Speaks, back in 2012. But Tony gave me these photos because he had the presence of mind to photograph the last real significant, the last outcrop of the outcropping Triassic sandstones and mudstones that were next to the below the Governor Secretary's cottage, but next to the main office building, the commissariat, the bond store building of TMAG back in 2005, before they were covered up with a retaining wall. So these are the rocks that actually made up the cliffs of Sullivan's Cove, but they've just been quarried all the way back from the original shoreline, all the way back to basically below this building. And I'll show you a couple of watercolours in a minute that actually show some of the steps in that process. Unfortunately, the view is a little bit more prosaic nowadays, with it's being concreted over, sadly. Luckily, Tony did at least take those photos. And but now it's just a little bit of a place to put your wheelie bins, which is kind of sad, really. And it'd be nice. Tony he suggested yesterday that it'd be nice if some thought could be put into the idea of maybe would it be possible to re-expose those sediments, but I guess that's kind of a big ask. But anyway, why is this building important? Because it's been such a pivot point for the changes in the foreshore of Sullivan's Cove. And so we can look at this picture by one of my favourite artists, Francis Simpkinson, who became Simpkinson de Veselo. He was a naval officer, not a professional artist. He was a naval officer that was stationed here in Hobart in the 1840s, mainly to work at the observatory up near Government House, the current Government House now. But he is just this absolutely brilliant artist, and most of his works are held by the Royal Society. He donated them to the Royal Society, or his family did when he died. And so they have this collection. It's a marvellous snapshot of Hobart in the 1840s. It's just magical stuff, really, for those of us liking stuff. But what's really important is there's the Government Secretary's cottage with the red arrow next to the bond store, which is now the TMAG headquarters, and there's the cuttings, the quarries that were probably originally done to into the cliff face, into the cliffs, the original cliff face, to create the fill that all this reclamation of the foreshore has been done on. The bond store is actually built largely on reclaimed land, and I think they must have just quarried away the sandstones and just dropped it all into the foreshore of the harbour to actually build the bond store on. And it came from the sandstone quarries, which eventually found their way all the way up to the Governor Secretary's cottage. The Government House is still there, the Flagstaff is still there. And then there's this other painting which also shows, it's still from the 1840s, but it shows more clearly the Governor Secretary's cottage. But it shows what's happened with regard to the streets getting ploughed through. This is Argyle Street, I think, being cut through to improve the access to the wharfs. And eventually Elizabeth Street would have the same thing happen. When they demolished the old Government House, they cut Elizabeth Street through so that you had all this better access to the wharves. The wharfage and the port facilities had eventually moved west from the old wharf. So this is a view from the old wharf, which is where the IXL factory is and where Hunter Island was. It was called the old wharf, but the centre of shipping really moved to the west, to Salamanca, to the new wharf, which became Salamanca Place. And eventually Government House was demolished because it was in valuable land in the centre of town, but it also, I think, to create better access to the waterfront, because prior to them cutting down Argyle Street like that, you could only get access to the waterfront by walking down steps. You couldn't actually take a horse and cart down to the waterfront on Argyle Street, and certainly not on Elizabeth Street. So when Government House was demolished, they cut all the streets down. So basically that's why Franklin Square seems to sit up so high above us, because the streets have all been cut down through the original topography. But the little building, the Governor Secretary's cottage, was there to witness it all. So this is 1879, where Hobart's kind of being made to look as much as possible like a smoggy, dirty London. But it's just the nature of the lithograph, but still a brilliant piece of work. No drones in those days. But why am I showing you this? Well, just because it's nice, but still in the nearly the 1880s by this stage when this was done. We can zoom in on it, and there's the Governor's Secretary's cottage still there. So it's kind of been a witness to all those changes around the waterfront. The waterfront is almost completely in its modern configuration, apart from Macquarie Point at this stage. So you know, Constitution Dock and all the rest of them have all been built by this stage, but the little building is still there. And I think you can just make out in the front of the little building that might actually be trying to represent the layering in the sediments that Tony's photos showed. I don't think that's a retaining wall. I think that's an attempt by the lithographer to actually represent the layering in the sediments. So that's a little record of the geology of that wall that Tony's photographs also shows. But yeah, so that's why I put this little building on the title slide. It's just been this witness to, along with the commissariat store and the bond store to a lesser degree, it's been a witness to all the changes that have occurred to the landscapes around Sullivan's Cove and Central Hobart. So I guess by this stage, you're probably thinking, well, you know, so what? It's all nice. Maybe it's nice to know. Maybe you don't think it's nice to know. But it is interesting that what I wanted to show here, and I hope it's interesting, is that this stuff isn't just nice to know. It's actually it's very relevant in many ways to urban planning, because understanding these old landforms might actually be useful to urban planning. And the way it might be useful is to, if I go back to my 1803, 1804 reconstruction, this is the current flood hazard mapping for that are available online from the City of Hobart. So basically what this shows, this is the flood prediction mapping for Central Hobart. We know that in, was it 2011, we had the, no, it was later than that, was Brisbane. We had floods in Central Hobart, which really impacted on the area around the City Hall and the museum. Well, this is the map that that actually shows the flood prediction mapping, and it's basically completely showing, it just recreates the original drainage pattern of 1804. So basically what happens when these flood events occur, nature just refines its original level. The watercourses are just reclaimed by the flood lines, no matter what we've done to them. So basically, the reason I keep flipping back and forth is even though the domain rivulet and the lower part, the lower reaches of the Hobart rivulet are not exposed at surface anymore, when these flood events occur, they are still there. They're still there beneath our feet. And even Montpelier Retreat returns to being a watercourse, or potentially could. And St David's Park, which is the original cemetery, even St David's Park, if you go and stand in the park near the rotunda in there, you can actually see that it's just a catchment to send drainage down into the head of, to the southwestern side of Sullivan's Cove. It's actually quite marked where the Supreme Court sort of area is. It's actually quite a distinctive catchment area. So anyway, so this stuff is relevant, and the reason it's relevant is because of all the, if we want to understand the flood risk of urban areas, especially urban areas that have been developed for a long, long time, like Central Hobart, if we have the records, we can still go back and reconstruct these original landforms, and they may help us create better flood prediction maps. So that's the point I'm trying to make here. So although it's nice to know what the landforms were in 1804, I think it's fascinating to know, and the way they influence the landscape usages in Hobart, my previous slides, they also could be much, much more directly useful in terms of predicting where flood events could occur, just by using the historic maps to understand where the historic wetlands and drainage lines were. Particularly wetlands are very important in some of the other cities, like Brisbane, for example. It's very handy to know where the wetlands were all around Brisbane, because so much of that city is flood prone. Yeah, so understand a pre-urban landscape will help you understand where flood events might occur. So I think it's relevant to the modern world and modern urban planning. So that's all I was really wanted to say about Hobart. I've got another, I'll mention Hobart again in a minute, but I wanted to actually spend a couple of slides just talking about Newtown. Now, we always hear about the convict settlement at Sullivan's Cove when we hear about the earliest history, the beginning of Hobart, but what we never hear about, or very rarely hear about, is the free settlers who were landed at Stainforth's Cove, which we now call Newtown Bay. They were sent 4 miles up the river, pretty much because they wanted to keep them away from the convict settlement. So the convict settlement was one thing, and the free settlers, they wanted to keep them at a distance from the convicts. So I guess for moral reasons and for security reasons. So they settled them at Stainforth's Cove. Now, I wanted to sort of lead into talking about Newtown Bay by going back to Hobart. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a jump, but I'm now back on Hobart, and I'm looking at the position where the Elizabeth Mall is, and the Rivulet, just in pale blue, because one of the really important aspects of opening up the north of the settlement of the camp of Hobart was the construction of that log bridge that happened in 1804, when they manoeuvred a few logs over the steeply incised watercourse, put some decking over the top of it, mainly just so they could access the timber resources to the north, just to the immediate north of the camp. But it became the main access to the north, and it eventually was rebuilt. The bridge was rebuilt in brick, and then it was rebuilt in stone, and it became known as Wellington Bridge. Now, you can actually still go and stand on Wellington Bridge at the very north end of the Elizabeth Mall, but it's all covered in shops. It's been covered in shops a bit like a medieval town, really since the 1840s, I think. So it had bookshops and things put over the top of it. So it's been built over, but you can still actually look down into it, and you can see it from all these photographs you can see of the bridge. It's still there. It's just all covered in urban development. But the bridge, the Wellington Bridge at the north end of the current mall, actually became a centre of commerce and socialising in early Hobart. Just for some reason, it was a commercial centre. Elizabeth Street was the main commercial street for a lot of early Hobart's history, and it's still the most interesting street in many ways when it comes to historic buildings in Hobart. But yeah, so it developed, the bridge is the key thing I wanted to talk about, because it became the access to the north. But before I move on, I just need to point out that even in this most densely urbanised commercial part of the city, the Hobart Rivulet still exists. In that, you can see it, even though it's covered over, it still exists in all the land tenure, the Cat and Fiddle Arcade, and all the buildings that actually covered over the rivulet later in the history of Hobart have a slightly different land tenure. So they have this shape that just reflects the rivulet. So hopefully you can see my cursor, but there's the funny alignments of buildings from kind of the middle left of the lower part of this zoomed in photo. You can follow them up to the Elizabeth Mall, and then it crosses the mall, and then the funny curving shape persists up to the top right. That's the course of the rivulet. So even though it's been built over, it was built over slightly later in the history of Hobart. So the buildings have a slightly different land tenure because they're following the land reserve over the rivulet. So even though the rivulet's undercover, it still has a major influence on the shape of the buildings in this most commercial part of the city. And then the Wellington Bridge is where that tree is in the centre, roughly where that tree is in the centre. And that was where the log bridge was that allowed access to the north. So what's this got to do with Newtown? Well, I'm sorry that the scale of this is not that crash hot, but the picture on the right, I've got a magenta arrow pointing at where the original log bridge was, now the Wellington Bridge. It became the main outlet of the camp to the north. and so developed into Elizabeth Street, but it continued on. But it continued, initially the road and the tracks up north there developed to access the timber resources, but other earth resources became very important up there on the way through to Newtown. So you ended up with the lime kilns, which were developed on these travertine deposits, which were coming out of the boulder beds on the slopes on the western side, and the brick fields, which were probably developed on possibly on weathered Triassic sediments, but also on probably on clays and other deposits in the upper reaches of the Domain Rivulet and some of its tributaries. But they were the brick fields for a long time. So they became a major source of lime burning and major sites of lime burning and brick making. And this little pretty picture up the top left of by John Skinner Prout, who was an artist who actually was here at the same time as De Veselo. They actually painted together sometimes. They were friends, I think. And Skinner Prout was a professional artist, and De Veselo was just a naval officer who did it as a hobby. And De Veselo is as good as John Skinner Prout, sometimes possibly even better. But this is a picture by Skinner Prout from up near, it must be taken, it's on the Newtown Road, that's the official title, which is the old Newtown Road, which is kind of Elizabeth Street. But it's interesting that the detail of this, not so much the figures in the foreground, but it's I think it's a lime kiln burning to the right there, where there's a bit of smoke coming on. And then there's piles of what look like piles of bricks to me, down to the left of the little cottage with the red roof. So I think he's captured, I don't know if he meant to, but he's captured the lime burning and the bricks, because there's very few plans. I haven't found any plans of the internal layout of the brick fields. I don't know what the pits were or where they were. I just know that that was the block that was allocated the brickfield. Now, the brickfield site became very important later on because it was eventually developed into a female hiring depot for female convicts when they shut down the Hulk, the former HMS Anson, which was a convict hulk. It was moored up in, further north. They built a permanent hiring depot for the female convicts, and then eventually that became a paupers institution. And then eventually in the 1920s, when Tasmania was fairly determined to wipe out its convict history, all that complex of buildings was demolished, and they turned it into the North Hobart Oval, which was the home of football in Tasmania, right up until very recent times when they redeveloped Bellarive. But the North Hobart Oval is actually built on the side of the brickfields, and the reason that land was available is because the brickfields were turned into a convict depot, and that was demolished in the 1920s to make way for a cricket ground, football ground. And the lime kilns, one of the main deposits for the lime kilns, is now a park with a skate park in it. But the other reason the road needed to go north was not only to join up with the settlers, the free settlers at Newtown, which is, I've represented their blocks of land in blue. I'll talk about them more in a minute. But it also was there to link up to the government farm. So the Cornelian Bay Cemetery and the head of Cornelian Bay itself were the original government farm, and that was where the first successful farming took place in the colony. And Robert Knockwood, the chaplain, the Anglican chaplain for Hobart from its earliest days, quite often talks about walking up to the government farm and, you know, having tea and dining with them up there and then walking back. It was kind of his country walk. And I have to say that sometimes when he was in the early days, he was walking at a distance from the settlement, and he would come across Aboriginal huts. He never came across the people, but he certainly came across their huts. So the people were certainly living up there too. But anyway, the story is of the development of the sort of the main northern access out of Hobart, which was all because of this little log bridge across the easily bridged part of the Rivulet, and then the brick fields and the lime kilns, the lime deposits being discovered, and then continuing on through to the government farm and Newtown Bay. So all these sort of little things, all these little decisions sort of set in place the main kind of northwest southeast axis of Hobart. nevertheless, so I'm finally going to talk about Newtown. Excuse me. Newtown Bay, which I've enclosed in this rectangular box on this 1793 chart. Sorry, it doesn't zoom in very well, but this is the best I can find of John Hayes's chart of the Derwent. John Hayes was he worked for the East India Company, and he was on his way to India, from India to China, I think. But he stopped in at the Derwent for some reason and named everything. So he named the River Derwent, he named a lot of the coves, such as Risdon Cove, along its shores, and he named Prince of Wales Bay, and he named Stainforth's Cove and Cornelian Bay, although I think Flinders named Cornelian Bay. Anyway, but he named Stainforth's Cove, and that's the area I'll try to cover in the box. But briefly, he just mentioned on his chart this feature that he called King George's Plains, and he marked it on his chart. Apparently he didn't leave any written records, but other people such as Tim Flannery in 2006 talked about King George's Plains, this 300-acre patch of quite fertile ground that Hayes sort of spotted in his brief survey of the River Derwent. And it's interesting that actually Flannery mentioned that they were adjacent to Prince of Wales Bay. But anyway, on this chart, it seems pretty clear to me that Hayes annotated the head of Newtown Bay as King George's Bay, King George's Plains. So I don't know whether the free settlers were put ashore in this particular place because Collins was aware of this work or not. I'm not sure it's actually mentioned anywhere, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't. And perhaps that, one of the reasons they chose Stainforth's Cove for the free settlers was because they were aware of Hayes's opinion of King George's Plains. And it was only, not that long before, 10 years before, 11 years before that Hayes was there. But anyway, I'm not sure about that. And then I've just noted the Hobart Rivulet, and the Hobart Rivulet seems to be named on this chart, but I can't read the name. But it looks like the Hobart Rivulet might have been given a name by Hayes as well. But anyway, why does this matter? Well, it became the focus of the free settler grants that were set up by when Collins wanted to move them some distance from the convict settlement. So this isn't a very good map either, but I wanted to use it because it's zoomed in on that chart by James Meehan that I showed on one of my very first slides. So it shows Stainforth's Cove, and these strange wedge-shaped blocks are actually the initial survey of the free settler grants, and they were all set up so that they had river frontage along the axis of the Hobart Rivulet. Now, it's very important when you're getting a land grant that you have access to water for your stock and your farming. So and you don't want to be landlocked by your neighbours. So all these grants, these colonial grants, tended to be set up so that all the settlers had their own water frontage, so they didn't have to cross anyone else's land to get to their water source. So, and they were meant to be allocated a particular amount of land. I think it was 100 acres. So I said that yesterday and I forgot to look it up. But they had to be given a certain amount of land. I think it was 100 acres. But they also needed to have their own water frontage. So what it resulted in when they were given the land at Newtown Bay was that ended up with these long rectangular blocks that had these narrow water frontages. So these unusual long rectangular blocks, and this is really common all across the Australian sort of cities. If you go to places like Perth and Adelaide, which are on plains, a lot of their street grids are influenced by these geometries of blocks that are just normal to any watercourse that happens to be crossing the plain. Very sort of quirky street patterns, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, that's what happened here. But also the Cornelian Bay Cemetery became the location of the first successful farming in the colony. Now, why is that? So this is my reconstruction of Newtown Bay with the free settler grants put on and the old and the new road extending northwest from the Wellington Bridge, the Elizabeth Street Bridge. So once again, these long rectangular blocks, all with their water frontages along Newtown Rivulet. and my reconstruction of Newtown Bay and the government farm. So why is this relevant? Well, it's actually kind of interesting to look at this. And in terms of geology, I don't know this for certain, but the geology of Cornelian Bay Cemetery and the Valley of Moona and all around Newtown, it's one of the largest occurrences of Cenozoic basalt along the western shore of the Derwent. And it's quite unusual geology. Most of the geology is dominated by Triassic sandstone, Permian sediments, or particularly dolerite. And but this is one occurrence of basalt, which I've shown in orange here. I haven't got a legend on this. And the strange pinker shade of orange is actually where the basalt is actually masked by just quaternary deposits, but there's still basalt known to be there. So this is the distribution of basalt around Newtown Bay. And I just think it's kind of interesting that it corresponds to the King George's Plains, and it corresponds to where the free settlers were placed. And I know that the free settlers were landed in an area where they thought that the ground was more fertile, and certainly Hayes thought that there was something about the plains here that made them look a bit more notable than a lot of the rest of the shore. So I'm just wondering whether the basaltic soils led to some of the success of farming in Newtown. It never became a great agricultural area, but later on in the history of Hobart, it became the place where people had their country houses. And there a lot of orcharding and even Chinese market gardens eventually around Newtown Bay. People like June Poncratz tell me that sort of thing. They were there when she was a kid. So I think it was quite a fertile area, and it might be simply because of the basalts that underlie it. And I'm just wondering whether that isn't a key geological influence on the early history of Newtown. Yeah, the fact that it's this unusual expanse of basalt in the area. But anyway, in terms of land use, the other interesting thing about the geometry of the free settler grants is that they really set in place this unusual street pattern in Moona and Newtown. The long rectangular blocks, which were granted as freehold land, eventually they've been subdivided. You know, lots of post-war subdivisions, even before the Second World War, they were being subdivided. And but the original land grants, when they were subdivided, set in place the road pattern for much of Moona, or all of Moona really, and Newtown. So even though we don't hear much about the history of the Newtown free settlers, their land grants have really set in place the pattern of urban development around Moona, Latana, Newtown, and simply because they were granted land that had to have their own river frontage along the Newtown Rivulet. So the Rivulet has actually set in place the street pattern of the surrounding urban development. And of course, later on, the government farm was redeveloped as the Cornelian Bay Cemetery, the major cemetery in central Hobart, even though it was a very fertile farmland. So that's just an interesting, I think that's an interesting outcome of the free settler grants in Newtown Bay, and just the way that the rivulet controls has influenced the urban development around it, and perhaps the basalt underlying the basaltic soils influenced any successful agriculture that happened there. So I'm getting to the end now. This is just my last couple of slides. I just wanted to briefly talk about some of the broader issues of urban geology in Australia. In a nutshell, we're not very good at it here, but what this project, looking at all the urban geology of all the Australian capital cities, has really convinced me that we do need to know more about it. And what's interesting is that if you look at the Hobart 1 to 25,000 scale geology map, which I'm showing here, in fact, this is actually an extract from that map. This is the landslide hazard series because it's a smaller map. But if you look at the area that I've really been talking about, which is central Hobart, which is the red box, that tiny little area is the most densely urbanised part of Hobart. But when we talk about geology maps, we're normally talking about regional scales. But when we want to know the geology of an area such as the central business district of a major city, where we're building skyscrapers and tunnels and car parks, underground car parks, and service corridors and sewers and all sorts of things for millions of people, we need to understand the geology in a lot more detail than even this lovely 25,000 scale map of Hobart. So Hobart is really well off in terms of having these excellent 25,000 scale maps, but most other cities in Australia are not. If you go to Sydney or Melbourne, the best maps you can find for the central business districts of those cities were produced in the 1980s. I think Sydney is 1 to 50,000 scale, and Melbourne is even worse. There's a 1980s map, but the earlier map is actually better. It's actually at 1 to 63,360, so it's at imperial scale, and it's a better map. So we don't really know what we need to know about the detail of these urban areas, and I think it's probably a good idea for the geological surveys to start thinking about this sort of stuff. They used to in the 1970s and the 80s, but they've kind of dropped the ball a bit on this, probably because there's other priorities. But I think it would be really useful if we start to re-implement urban geology programs in our geological surveys. And the other thing is that there's no 3D geological maps, models available for any of these urban areas. And there isn't even a drill hole data set, really. I'm trying to build one for Hobart based on some collar information that Colin Masengard from MRT sent me, but I'm trying to add in the geology. But there's no 3D geological models of the subsurface of any of our CBDs, not in the open source domain anyway, not in the public domain. Some of the consultancies have built some, and you can see you can see YouTube videos, some of them have built some, but none of them are in the open, in the public domain. No 3D subsurface geology models of any of our cities. And I think that is it's not a great strategy for there's so much underground infrastructure going into these places now. And I just think we need to do that. And I think the geological surveys would be the logical home for that sort of stuff. And then finally, this is the slide I flipped over to quickly yesterday. Something I won't talk about now, it's for another talk. But one of the things I haven't even talked about is that how does geology influence our urban environments? That's kind of what I've been talking about. But one of the things that it really influences our urban environments is the use of local stone in the construction of buildings in each city. So each city in Australia, apart from the devastation that we've wreaked on our architecture since the 1960s and our desire to cover it all in glass and concrete, the reason that our city is still recognisably unique is because of the buildings, mostly the buildings that were created before the 1960s. And those buildings usually were constructed from local stone. So if you think about Hobart, I'm hoping that if you thought about what is this, if there's any architectural element that makes you think about Hobart, I'm hoping that you would think it's sandstone. So all the great heritage buildings of Hobart are built from sandstone. And the other unsung hero of Tasmanian sort of urban character, I think, is the red gravel driveway. Most people in urban areas, and where I live, I have a red gravel driveway, and I did actually manage to get a photo of my driveway into this. This is actually just an illustration of my book. But sandstone and dolerite, particularly red gravel, are two of the characteristic built elements of the built environment of Hobart. But in Sydney, I'm hoping you would think of Hawkesbury sandstone. In Brisbane, you would think of the really unusual stone they have there is an ignimbrite from the Kangaroo Point Cliffs. They also have some beautiful sandstone from Helidon out to the west of Brisbane, beyond Ipswich. But they have the Brisbane tuff, this ignimbrite that forms Kangaroo Point, and it was quarried right up until the 1970s and from several other places around Brisbane. But the Anglican Cathedral is probably the major building that's ever been constructed from it. But but it used to be quite an important curving stone. But then Adelaide has the metamorphic bluestone and the calcrete. And Perth, if you've ever been to Perth, I'm hoping that you would think of Hackett Hall at the University of Western Australia, or the old fire station in East Perth, which are built from limestone, Tamala limestone. So Perth is a limestone city. Adelaide is metamorphic bluestone and calcrete, which I think I've already mentioned. But then if you go to Melbourne, sometimes gloomy but always amazing is what uses they've put basalt to. The bluestone from originally from around the city area, but mostly most of the buildings were constructed from bluestone that was sourced from quarries out towards where I originally come from, which is the western suburbs, around Footscray. The main industry of Footscray back in the mid to late 19th century was bluestone quarrying. But the amazing back lanes of Melbourne and curbstones and so many of the churches and other buildings and keystones and footings of major buildings of the 19th century in Melbourne are all built from basalt bluestone. So yeah, so that's the talk for another day. But each of our cities has a unique character, and it's really set by the local rock from which it's built. I think that's probably my last statement. Yeah, so I hope I've managed to convince you that geology had an impact in very tiny ways. Small things did have a big effect on Hobart, and they're still affecting it now. It's the layout of Hobart is the current layout of Hobart is the result of its original landscape of 1804, which I find kind of remarkable. But all our cities have similar stories. It's quite remarkable just how durable these effects are. And just as some final acknowledgements, I really do need to acknowledge the late Frank Bolt. Is a chap I really would have liked to have met for his marvellous books on Hobart and early history of Hobart. Tony Hope for giving me the photos. I particularly need to thank Sequent for providing Leapfrog Geo to the university. A lot of it, when I was doing most of this work, I did most of it kind of as a university researcher, and I was using the research licenses from UTAS that provided from my current sort of honorary position at UTAS. And the marvellous work that the state libraries, university libraries and government agencies have all done to digitise these records. It's just remarkable that I could sit in a place like Newman in the northwest of WA and be starting to do this sort of work on digitised resources, which have got so much better in the last 10 years. It's just pretty much every important record has been digitised now, and that's remarkable. And of course, I've got to recognise Google Earth, just what an amazing resource it is for looking at these landscapes of urban areas. So that's it from me. The last thing I'll do is I did take an opportunity yesterday to put in a shameless plug for the book that I produced about this sort of material. It isn't as well illustrated as I would have liked it to be, because it was a bit of a restrictive format. But if you would like to know more about what I've been talking about, this is the book that I published, that was finally published in March this year. It has a chapter on each of our capital cities. So Hobart is one of several chapters. So I've talked about all the Australian colonial capitals apart from, but I don't discuss Canberra. Thanks for listening. Cheers.